right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the launch of some products we're really excited about here at SALT. And we're pleased to announce the launch of the Comprehensive Electronic Catch Documentation and Traceability, or ECDT, principles and the associated pathway to apply them. My name is Jenny Barker. I am the Chief of Party for SALT, which is the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability. As we've asked, please go ahead and put your name and affiliation in the chat so we have a good idea of who's here today with us. And for the agenda, really today we're going to share a little bit about SALT, which supported the development of the principles. We want to tell you how we got started and decided to develop the principles in the first place. We'll share the process of how we went about designing the principles, and then we'll actually show you the new principles and the pathway to the principles, which is the online tool for implementation. And then finally, we want to talk about how we intend to apply these principles and how we can support those of you who are interested in using the principles. Today, you'll be hearing from Sarah Lewis, who is the lead for SALT on the principles work, and Bryn O'Donnell, who is the senior program manager on SALT. I want to give special thanks to them, but also the entire team who was involved at SALT and Fishwise in supporting this, and a special thanks to our consultative committee who you'll hear more about later, who was instrumental in working on the principles. Before we get started, I want to ask you, sort of as you're listening today and hearing about this principles and the pathway, really just keep in mind thinking about sort of how these principles might support your work, because that's really what they're here to do. They're here to serve the community, and we really want to make sure that they do. So keep that in mind as you hear our presentation today. First, quickly about SALT. Many of you know that illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing represents one of the most complex issues confronting the world today. And addressing IUU fishing and the associated labor and human rights abuses, inadequate fisheries management, all the things that come with it, really affects millions of people that depend on fisheries for their livelihoods. And so as a result, the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, partnered with Walton Family Foundation, the Packard Foundation, the Moore Foundation, and decided to form a new alliance to really tackle these issues, which was SALT. It's implemented by Fishwise, which is my organization, and we're a nonprofit sustainable seafood consultancy. So SALT was really conceived as a collaboration and learning project, and it focused on bringing together seafood industry, governments, NGOs, and many others to really learn and create innovative solutions around legal and sustainable seafood. And we really wanted to focus on traceability as the tool to tackle those issues. And so the vision for SALT was, at the end of its 5-year timeline, we want a global community that has increased engagement and information sharing that leads to broader uptake of comprehensive electronic catch documentation and traceability programs. And that is in order to support social, environmental, and economic well-being. And just to clarify what I mean when I say comprehensive, it means it should capture ecological, social, and economic data related to the seafood products, so we can use that data to strengthen effective fisheries management, support legal and equitable human welfare conditions for seafood laborers, and then also just stop illegal products or mislabeled products from entering markets. It's a 5-year contract. You can see the 4 key objectives we have on this slide, which is really around ensuring that electronic traceability is working for seafood producing countries, supporting industry and their needs, and also really taking into consideration the importance to seafood workers. So how do we get here? In order to design a project that's really effective and impactful, in the first year, Fishwise led a co-design process to identify key stakeholders and critical issues that were impacting seafood traceability. And when we say co-design, from our perspective, that really means designing and trying to develop and identify solutions with stakeholders that are affected by that, instead of for or without consultation. We solicited feedback from those stakeholders and trying to really identify what are the innovative ways we can work together using collaboration, using better learning to advance traceability globally. We hosted 3 regional, what we call co-design workshops or data labs. We issued a survey also to interested parties. And so you can see the breadth of feedback we got from the slide. And what really ended up happening was in those 3 events, attendees proposed 33 kind of unique, innovative ideas. At the time, we called them collaborative actions, and they were all related to electronic catch documentation and traceability. And so the conversations were diverse, but that really gave us the fodder to figure out what would it make sense for SALT to prioritize? Where should our focal areas be? It's also worth noting that SALT in the first year had what we call the Co-Design Advisory Committee, and that had representatives from NOAA, the US State Department, the EU, WWF, the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, Environmental Justice Foundation, and others. So they were really instrumental in us identifying what priority areas we focused on. And then that actually group has transitioned now to be a permanent advisory function for SALT, and we've actually expanded it. So we have new groups now like the Marine Stewardship Council, the Global Tuna Alliance. We've added some experts like Francisco Blaha and Richard Stavis, and we're really thankful for all of their support and their inputs as we decide how to best advance traceability. So what was prioritized? So based on the data from co-design process and in consultation with the advisory committee, there were 2 main thematic areas focused on here. And then we also identified 2 key target audiences for that work. And just as a note, what is reflected here represents more than half of what those kind of unique collaborative actions were that people identified. So we really took that data and information and poured it directly into our strategy. So the first one was incentivizing comprehensive electronic catch documentation and traceability, mapping those barriers, understanding where and what additional information is needed in order to convince people that this is a really good solution to combat IUU fishing. And then the other one was a set of principles that could help people once they had decided to seek such solutions or use traceability as the tool they needed. How would they do that? How would they share data effectively? How would they take a pilot from something that was successful to something that's scalable? And so we heard that from multiple different of those collaborative actions, and that's why we decided to prioritize those 2. The audiences for SALT overall are seafood producing countries and industry. We prioritize seafood producing countries as that's where there seemed to be the most need that we identified. There are some really successful industry alliances and we partner with them and support them, but it felt like there was less attention being paid to some of the producer countries that we were looking at. And just to sort of share what we mean by that, seafood producing countries for us means more so developing countries because we are funded and supported by USAID and the foundations. They're working in several of those countries. And so that's where our priority has been. And just a few notes on why these types of broad sort of themes were selected. We know that there's no one size fits all approach to traceability. But in order to achieve our goal of transparent, legal, sustainable seafood supply chains, we need to have different options for different users and different people within that supply chain. But at the same point, there is a need to bring the existing information together. And there is a need for some level of consistent guidance in the end about what has worked, what hasn't. And that's really what the principles seek to achieve. I also want to say that we acknowledge and have leveraged the breadth of sort of traceability guidance that exists out there already. It's been developed by various groups, but some of it's focused more on a specific region, right, or a type of harvest. And SALT really wanted to take that information as the foundation for the comprehensive list of principles, but then think about how that could be applied in a more global context, regardless of where it was or the type of effort. And that's why we've decided to focus on those comprehensive principles in something that can be applied really holistically. So how did we design them? In the spirit of co-design that we designed SALT with, we went with the same approach and created a consultative committee with experts on this topic. And they were asked to bring their ideas, their thoughts on the products and principles and provide feedback on content, the structure of the product. And that consultative committee was launched at the end of 2019. I want to pause now to say thank you to them. Their support for us over more than a year now has been incredibly valuable. Some of you are on the webinar today, and this is your achievement as much as it is anyone's achievement. That committee was composed of expert stakeholders, and we wanted people, obviously, who were interested in applying the principles, because this information is only as good as the application it gets. But we had 35 expert stakeholders from 17 countries across the globe, from Senegal to Indonesia to the Philippines to South Africa, Tanzania. And we engaged them in about 6 webinars. I think we solicited information on a couple of drafts of this product. And they were really essential. And the other element about this is to talk about really who the key audience for the principles was. And we decided that the principles could best serve a producer country government audience. And the reason that that was the case is because they really have the authority and the responsibility to implement policies, to reduce risk to workers, for ecological and economic management of their fisheries. So that was the sort of primary audience, but it is worth noting here that we think that these will be really useful to plenty of other stakeholders, whether it's NGOs, industry, technology vendors, et cetera. You can see, the diversity of how our consultative committee was made up. But there was one challenge that we kind of kept facing with the consultative committee, and that was the principles centered around incorporating best practices on social responsibility. And of the 3 main focus areas, really that one was the one that had been the least tested or proven, the idea that you could use data collected in traceability systems to address some of the social issues, including labor and human rights abuses that are happening in seafood supply chains. And so we drew on some of the expertise from Fishwise's Social Responsibility Division. We talked to other initiatives and heard their recommendations as they had been investigating similar issues. But as the work developed, we decided we should invest in more expertise on social responsibility and human rights to really complement all of that other environmental and governance expertise we had. So we hired 2 experts in the arena to be our consultants. That's Judy Gerhardt and Rainer Braun, and they really helped us to solicit additional external input on the principles from that social responsibility lens, with a really cognizant eye towards that. And so they collected feedback, and that feedback on the principles from those different unique stakeholders was considered kind of along with the feedback from the consultative committee and incorporated. So before I turn it over to Sarah, who's actually going to tell you what the principles are, I just gave you all the fun background. I just want to sort of seed these 3 questions for you, which is, be thinking as you hear from her what the principles are, what that pathway to implementing them looks like where might that overlap with or help the work you're trying to do? And do you have ideas about where we might apply them? Because that's really where we're headed. So Sarah, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Just bear with me a moment while I get my screen sharing started. Okay. How's that? Can you see the slide? Okay. All right, so yes, very exciting work that's led into what we're about to explore together, which is the principles and the pathway. I'm Sarah Lewis. I'm the Traceability Division Director at Fishwise, and as Jenny mentioned, I've been really working with the consultative committee and our team at Fishwise to develop this work, as well as working with our consultants. So just to sort of get a little bit more specific on what we were trying to achieve with the
the principles. You can start at the home page here.
Oops. Sorry, we had a technical glitch. Are we okay, guys? Okay. All right. So, anywho, we will get into a little bit more about what the principles we're actually trying to achieve, specifically in terms of their design and rollout. So the principles are set as they're a set of minimum best practices that we're hoping producer countries, as Jenny already said, can really consider and implement when designing and rolling out ECDT programs that will be comprehensive in nature. So as Jenny explained, we're looking at things that will help realize all 3 of those potential benefits, but but they can be sort of balanced in different ways depending on the goals that the individual producer country has in terms of where they're going to start and what their needs are as a group. So they need to be high level and flexible. They will require different technological and sort of standards to be implemented depending on where they're applied. So they needed that level of flexibility, but there needed to be some clarity around what it is that the best practice, the goals that people are trying to achieve in doing this are. So they also will apply to all wild harvest species and supply chain scales. So we're trying to bridge needs for folks that are rolling these out to full regions or maybe multi transnational fisheries that they're managing versus also being applicable to a smaller scale or a pilot that might be happening at a smaller scale. And lastly, I want to note that we're viewing these principles, even though we're having our launch event today, we're viewing these as sort of a living document. So we're looking to put these out there based on what we've heard, the expertise that we've had, input, the literature review that we've conducted of existing resources and initiatives. We're doing essentially the first round of what we're hoping we would then be able to revise based on implementation knowledge and sharing that we can do later. So once we get these out, we will be putting them into practice and then revisiting them and trying to improve them through time. It's a really dynamic space right now. This is a new area to try to bring together these benefits in this way. And so we're really excited to be able to continue to build them and to expand and clarify the guidance as time progresses. So with that, I'm actually going to take us right over to the space that we have these housed on the SALT website. So if you go to the SALT page, as of today, you will be able to find, whoops, let's see if I can expand it this way. Here we go. It's not letting me grow this any bigger. Hold on, everybody. There we go. Okay, so the SALT webpage has now a live space for the principles, which is very exciting, and it allows for a more dynamic experience of the principles and the pathway tool as well. I will get into some of the other formats and how you can navigate this space in a moment, but I just want to start by introducing you to the principles themselves. So here they are. They're presented not in a sequential or priority order. They should be taken together. They're all at the same level in terms of being applicable to the whole process that we'll be walking you through in terms of implementation. The first is use data to inform decision-making. And this principle really relates to going through an analysis of existing data sources and identifying gaps and needs, as well as thinking about who needs access to information to achieve the program's goal. So there's guidance also about collecting data and adaptively managing comprehensive eCDT programs to address changing needs. The second one is create a program that is electronic, interoperable, and data secure. And this principle is focusing on the application of technologies to support the goals of your comprehensive program. Here we have be inclusive and collaborative with stakeholders. And the guidance here covers a lot of the important topics related to how to identify and meaningfully collaborate with stakeholders. So this would be stakeholders that are across governments and beyond. So the full range, not just those within the producer country that might be the audience for this work, but the full range of stakeholders that will need to be involved in these processes. In particular, it calls out the importance of considering the power dynamics and relationships among stakeholders in the consultative process. For instance, workers and businesses, men and women, governments in the private sector, and being sensitive to the ongoing needs of all participants. So next is build a lasting and scalable program. And this one encourages implementers to think about how they will fund, institutionalize, and maintain support for their comprehensive traceability program from the start. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to sustain your program and scale your program from the very beginning of your project. Next is maximize ecological, social, and economic benefits. And this is the principle that really covers guidance for approaching comprehensively your ECDT program. It includes ways to build upon existing systems and mitigate negative impacts of the ECDT data collection on workers. So this is a very important piece of getting at that true comprehensiveness. And next is address data and verification needs across fisheries and supply chains. And so this one recognizes that every producer, country, and fishery will have unique data needs and challenges. And so the guidance for this principle relates to navigating those needs with sensitivity to the workers and an eye towards verification. And so with that, I'm going to navigate us back to our slides here. And I'd like to just take a moment to share a little bit more about how we're viewing this work. So as Jenny explained, the principles were created to create some consistent guidance for this space. So essentially like a lighthouse where each producer country is sort of steering their own ship. The hope is that whether implementers have a long journey or a shorter journey to get to comprehensive sustainability traceability, they can all begin moving towards that common destination. And so, however, naturally, once a destination is identified, the very next question that comes to mind is, how do I get there from where I am? How do I navigate my individual circumstances to arrive at that place? And so that is why we actually also created a second product. So in addition to the principles, we created the pathway. And the pathway is truly a way to get from your individual circumstances and see that goal of comprehensive ECDT programs and get there from wherever you might be beginning. So if you've already got some tools to build on, or if you're starting at the very beginning, you might have a different journey, but ultimately you can start making that progress. So the pathway to the principles, well, what is it really? It's guidance for making the principles actionable. It lays out steps to applying them when administering or improving the comprehensive electronic traceability programs that you are striving to achieve. It's broken down into 3 phases. So there's initiate, design, and implement. And this way, the user of the pathway can find guidance that's more closely aligned with where they are. So they can navigate, and they can also look ahead and see what the whole sort of spectrum of considerations that they're going to need to get through looks like. It is not a prescriptive standard. So it's not going to prescribe specific standards, technologies, or regulations that should be chosen by the users. Rather, as Jenny mentioned, the principles and pathway are not a standard. They are guidance for things to consider and appropriate times and sequences to consider them. Then they link those considerations to existing resources that the whole traceability, social responsibility, and other communities have generated. So in addition, I think it's worth noting in terms of what went into the creation of the pathway and how the pathway and the guidance relates to some of those existing standards and existing resources. Standards like the FAO guidance, the WEST principles, the United States Agency for International Development's resources or USAID resources, all of those were brought into this process really early through the literature review that we initially conducted when we were thinking through these principles and how we might construct them. So they came in early and they're also available through the pathway. So in a moment, I'll give you a tour of how the pathway works. But these principles and the pathway are not, what they're trying to do is essentially bring together the guidance that helps achieve the comprehensive lens that we were setting out to do. So some of the principles, some of the guidance that existed was out there for data collection. Some of it was out there related to specific geographies. Some of it existed for how to support human rights. And these things, they were geographically and topically diverse. And so we looked across all of those and thought about how we could bring them together into one set of guidance. So they're embedded within this work, but we are not trying to create a new standard. And as I mentioned before, the principles and the pathway in particular, being the implementer guide, will likely never be truly finished because there will always be new resources and new learnings that we can bring to this work to continue to improve and expand upon its utility. So what we've done so far is create two formats for users to navigate this information. If you're thinking, okay, well, how do I get my hands on this and how do I use it? The simplest version is a PDF report that will be downloadable. This online version is housed on the SALT website, and that is where you will find both the principles as I just showed you, but also the pathway to the principles. And we're really excited to make this available in translated versions. We have plans for Spanish, French, Vietnamese, and Bahasa, but we also are welcoming suggestions for those that might be implementing this. If they need a translation to another language, certainly get in touch with us and please let us know. And with that, I'm going to quickly give you a tour, play a tour of the website so that you can familiarize yourself with how to navigate it. And then we'll hop back in and we'll go through a couple examples of how a user might actually leverage the principles in practice.
To access the online version of the Comprehensive Principles and the pathway to the principles, you can start at the home page here. In the navigation bar, you'll see that there are pages with details about each principle, an About page, which features an FAQ and also more information on the background of the principles, an Apply Them page, which takes you to the pathway, and finally, a page with additional resources. You'll also see the download button on the far right. On this homepage, you'll see there are 6 principles blocks. Hovering over any of them will cause the definition of the principle to appear. To find out more about a principle, there are 2 potential routes. You can either select the principle of interest from the drop-down here, or by clicking on the relevant box. When you arrive to a page about a principle, you can read a full description up top here. Next, scrolling down to the Apply the Principle section, you can see how you might apply this principle in your work. There are 3 main phases to building an electronic catch documentation and traceability program: initiate, design, and implement. Depending on which phase you are interested in, you can click on the corresponding tab for initiate, design, or implement to read more about how this principle manifests in that phase, as well as find some links to relevant guidance. If you are interested in the pathway to the principles, which is step-by-step guidance to creating a comprehensive ECDT program, you can either select this box here at the bottom of every page, or by going back to the navigation bar and selecting Apply Them. This brings you to the Pathway to the Principles page. Here we have more information about the pathway, And then we also have a principles key to remind you which icon belongs to which principle. And then we have the step-by-step guidance. We've broken down all of the steps into 3 phases, those initiate, design, and implement phases. And so you can click on any of these images to see the different steps pop up that are relevant to that phase. Underneath the images are the guidance steps. On the left of every step, you can see the icon of the principle that this step relates to. You can click on a step to find out more information and to also find relevant guidance that might help in the application of this step. Finally, if you are interested in applying the principles to your work or have a question, you can click at the very bottom here to reach out to SALT.
Great. So right now, I'd like to sort of transfer from that tour, which I think we will be sharing out via, we'll have it on the web, I believe, or we'll share it via a message to participants. And it's just helpful for knowing how to navigate and get around on the website. But we're going to transfer from that to imagining essentially a couple users that we had in mind when we were building this tool. So the pathway and the principles website are tools that would hopefully help folks navigate this guidance in a couple of different ways. So the first sort of exercise we're going to do is imagining a government stakeholder in a country that has some trace work going on. So they already are doing some catch data, electronic catch data collection and reporting, but they're curious about how they might be able to leverage their information collection and their current efforts potentially to support and realize some social benefits. So a person from that producer country wants to know more. What would they do? Well, hopping back over to the page, as Bryn just toured us through, we could start on the principles page, and that's these blocks that we already visited a moment ago. And so if this stakeholder is interested in building on potentially some traceability work that they already have, they might start with this principle: maximize ecological, social, and economic benefits. So as they click on that, they're taken to a dedicated page for that principle where they can dive into the information in a more detailed way. So what they'll see here, starting off with the definition, is a description of what the principle is about. And going down, they see information on the pathway: initiate, design, and implement. So for this principle in the initiate phase, they see that there is a guidance to gather economic data to prepare for cost-benefit analysis. Well, this might be something that's rather familiar to them because as someone that's working in setting up traceability projects at a government level, it's likely that they would have some familiarity with cost-benefit analysis. But they're noticing this next one: be inclusive in identifying stakeholders. So they see right away that this is an area that they're curious to know more. They can find guidance related to stakeholder identification immediately and follow that. These guidance down here are examples, and if they press this find more relevant resources, they can dig into even more guidance that relates to this principle. So each principle has a varying amount of existing guidance associated with it, and that can be found down here. But right off the bat, they're able to see something that feels a little bit more familiar to them potentially, and something that seems a bit new that they want to learn more about. They can also click over to the next phase in the design section and find additional guidance on maximizing ecological and social benefits. So here, you know, this user will find additional resources about social safeguards. This is really maybe where they're starting with designing an ECDT program to fit within a larger fisheries management program. So that might be their objective. So they can dig in more to sort of engage with where they started from, the place of curiosity where they began looking at these principles, but they're also slowly being sort of brought into what all that principle actually relates to. So the comprehensive idea of also identifying how workers will be supported and thinking about safeguards. And so it's a way to follow, start with a place that where you are and what you're more familiar with. And then you can, through navigating the principles, start to explore what other pieces of work you'll need to sort of build on from there and what relevant guidance there is for that growth. So another potential user might not so much be coming at this as a learning opportunity, just out of curiosity. They might actually be starting to want to apply the principles right away to a fishery that they have in mind. So let's imagine a different user in another place is noticing that there's a lot of risk of, or they're hearing about risk of illegal fishing or social responsibility, human rights violations in a certain fishery. And so their interest in navigating the principles is really coming from a sense of urgency to begin addressing and making progress on those risks. They also might be motivated because there's political pressure or external pressure on them to begin thinking about things beyond their typical role. So perhaps they come from the fisheries management space, but now they're realizing that they have to start thinking more broadly, more comprehensively about these issues. So they might go up to the apply them space, which takes them to the pathway to the principles. And this is where we're imagining a user that needs to sort of think, okay, what do I start with? Where does my work really begin? And what does the path to this end goal look like in terms of beginning, middle, and end, or those sort of sequences? So as we've seen from the tour, there are these 3 phases. In the pathway, instead of navigating the guidance principle by principle, you're able to navigate the guidance by phase. So you're seeing multiple principles, and all of them are associated with the initiate phase. So across all 6 principles, we've mapped them to how they manifest at different phases of the work. So for instance, the user that I was imagining that is responding to some of the risks, but maybe doesn't have that much infrastructure already in existence to help deal with those risks, might start with this one, assessing existing exposures and risks. So if they click there, they're able to find guidance about identifying risk, assessing what risks are out there and where they need to pay attention, as well as, again, relevant guidance. And again, they're able to find more guidance by pressing this button. So they might say, okay, I understand some of my risks. What do I need to do now in terms of figuring out who to work with to address them? Well, then again, in initiate, they would come down and they would see the stakeholder identification guidance, and they would press it and it would drop down and provide tailored information about how and who to identify in terms of governments, effective fisheries, etc., to begin dealing with this work. So it really is a way of sort of mapping the considerations that one needs to weigh, as well as the timeline and the steps and the guidance. So if you only need to start with a couple tasks, you can begin making progress. You can sort of sequence your efforts in a way that allows for initiation of these programs. So lastly, I would say if they're moving on they're curious about what lies ahead in terms of, okay, I'm at the initiate phase, but I don't want to initiate anything until I understand the full process. Then, of course, you can go through and see how the different principles are manifesting across the design phase. The design phase is much more about selecting technologies, actually creating the standards or protocols and identifying the tools that you will leverage with your ECDT program. So initiate focuses on kicking things off, identifying stakeholders, setting goals, learning from existing systems, and all the research that kind of needs to happen at the very start of initiating one of these programs. Design is when you've done that and you understand what your goals are, and now you're matching your tools, your technologies, your approaches to those goals, and you're working alongside your collaborators that you've already identified. Implementing is where you actually are starting the work and thinking about scaling and sustaining that work through time. So all of the principles will manifest in different ways across those different phases of the pathway. With that, I will go ahead and conclude by handing it back over to Jenny, because that really is the cue for us to start thinking about. These are the resources. We are designing them to hopefully allow for multiple ways for people to think about how they might apply to one's work. And now we're excited to start thinking through that next phase of our work in terms of implementation. So Jenny, please take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. That was excellent. Really great to see all that hard work, and really great to hear the story about how different users might be able to use it. And I think we'll just get more and more examples as we go to the application. Can everyone see my screen okay? Does it seem all right? Great. Okay. I want to take this opportunity as we close up, and then want to take a little bit of questions and answers, but take this opportunity to kind of add some clarity also on what Sarah was speaking about kind of what the principles are and what they are not. The principles are offering guidance. They're not a regulation. They're not a standard, as Sarah said. And, SALT understands that this is a busy space. That's a good thing in some ways, because it means there's a lot of dedicated work in traceability, and there's a lot of interest, which is really important. That also can make things confusing at times. And so I'm going to reference two really important pieces of work happening around traceability, and sort of make the comment and note that the work we're doing with the principles and the pathway is very much so supportive of these two pieces of work. It is reinforcing the things that these two pieces of work are doing, but wanted to provide some clarity in case there was any confusion. The first is NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP as they call it. And SIMP is a US regulation related to seafood imports. The objective is to reduce or eliminate the supply of illegal seafood products entering US markets. And so that being a US government regulation, obviously it's quite different than what the principles are. It's seeking guidance, but I will say that SIMP is referenced in the pathway as a key source of information to support your traceability work. And so these principles are very much so aligned in order to support the idea that we have better traceability systems, and governments support traceability of seafood products in the supply chain. The other really big piece of work is the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, or the GDST, which was launched in 2017. And it's really a forum for seafood industry. And they worked together over 3 years to draft the first ever global standards in seafood traceability. And they launched what was called the GDST Standards and Guidelines for Interoperable Seafood Traceability Systems. And that really included a key part of that was the key data elements related to seafood production as really that primary big deliverable. And again, really important advancement. The industry is leading in the traceability space. But again, wanted to share specifically, if you're hearing some similar words, that's intentional, because under our creative program that is electronic, interoperable, and data secure, we're really calling on groups to prioritize interoperability, much like the GDST calls for, but also to use those standardized formats that they've called for with KDEs and consider aligning with such really big important things like the industry data standards developed in GDST or the import data requirements for market states that exist in SIMP. And so just to say that this is supporting and not redundant, and also to say that both some architects of SIMP and those who are still involved and those who have also led GDST are part of SALT advisory committee. So we very much so keep in touch and are all really trying to help this body of work be complementary and supportive and really additive, as opposed to in any way sort of conflicting, but they're unique and different products. So finally, now that you've heard about the pathways and the principles, application is really the essential step to creating the change that we seek as part of SALT. And there are several ways that SALT is looking to test the principles, apply them, and really see how we can support you if you're interested in using the principles within your own traceability program. I have a couple of options here just for you to keep in mind. Excuse me. The first is to connect with experts. So SALT staff can offer guidance and support on application, or we can link you to some of the experts in our broad network of our broader SALT community, which is more than 1,000 participants now. So we really want to keep that collaboration aspect of it and provide that support you may need. We understand that you're probably coordinating with certain partners already, especially if it's a producer country government, that NGOs may be partnering with those governments. We are happy to support local partners or local NGOs you may be working with and talking to help support application of the principles. And then finally, learning events. So we can convene key stakeholders, help identify some of those key stakeholders that Sarah was just outlining that should be included from the beginning. And how do you start those conversations that allow you to execute better or implement the comprehensive traceability principles as they are. And just to note that we have been already kind of supporting some of this work and talking with different NGOs and governments in Southeast Asia and South America. So we're really hopeful that there will be strong interest moving forward. So there are those questions, again, that you can feel free to answer in the chat around, now that you kind of understand a little bit more of what the principles are and what the pathway is. If you think that there's a way it could be beneficial for you, beneficial for your work, or SALT could support you in any way, please do think through those. And just a quick sort of statement on what's next. We, as Sarah already mentioned, we have translated versions coming soon in the coming months in Bahasa, Vietnamese, French, and Spanish. So we really think that that's essential for to make the principles application successful, as we're looking for identify different countries around the world where they may be used. We're going to do more of these kind of learning sessions on the pathway to the principles, like the teaser that sort of Sarah gave around, if you were a user, what might it look like to go through and navigate some of that. We'll do some more of those sessions. It's really important to note that we expect the social components of the comprehensive nature of the principles to really evolve and continue to grow. This is a new important space, but we're just learning enough about it. And as I think we apply the principles and as we get deeper into this work, we hope to really expand and grow the thinking on and the ability to use that data to really help improve the lives of people working in seafood supply chains. And then finally, we just need to hear from you about what you think would work, what you need, what more information you might need, what you think might be a challenge for you to do it. And we'll work with you as best as we can to serve your needs. So you can just feel free to contact us at salt@fishwise.org, and we will be as big of a support as we can. So with that, I want to say thank you and open it up to any questions you may have. We will be sending you some information about sort of a quick primer, which is a 2-pager on what the principles are and what the pathway is. And so we'll be sharing that with you. I'm quickly now going to put in a link to the actual principles themselves so you can go navigate on your own. And let me just sort of stop sharing my screen and look forward to hearing from people in the Q&A or questions in the chat.
So we have one question in the chat right now. Does SALT support governments?
Does SALT support governments? That could mean a couple of different things. Let me try and answer that to the best of my ability. So SALT can provide what we might call technical assistance, capacity building. We can certainly have conversations and sort of help walk through, think through, help with the design of a system, depending on what the needs are. We can't necessarily give funding support or anything like that to governments at this point, but we can certainly offer that sort of human resource kind of level of support. It could also be a learning event if there's of interest. So if you are interested in seeking support for a certain government, please reach out to us and we can talk about just what the options are, how much, where you are in your process, and we'll kind of do a little assessment and figure out how we could support you. Oh, thanks, Jonas. Okay, great. Any other like questions or thoughts or feedback from anyone? I see that there's a question in the Q&A. Looks like it is just answered. Great, thanks, Bryn.
I'd like to take this opportunity, since we have time, to send out a poll. I'm curious to see, to answer those questions, like how can you apply these principles? So I'll shoot this out to our attendees now, and feel free to answer.
I see an interesting question from Marta in the chat too. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that? Or say, what is the smallest scale where you can have a viable traceability system? If you have an answer, please go ahead.
I want to hear yours too. But I mean, for my work with companies, my answer is any scale. It would just be that you would adapt the level of information, the sort of tools that you are using. Certainly the smaller fisheries have unique challenges compared to larger industrial ones in terms of being able to afford certain technologies, but they also sometimes have shorter supply chains, which can help in other ways with traceability. So yeah, it's hard to answer specifically, but really there are tools and approaches that any scale can implement.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I think we've seen examples, and we could send you specifically some resources from the SALT website and dive deeper that, there are, as more and more need is obvious, there are innovative, relatively cheap, solar-based sort of systems that we know can be on relatively small boats. And so there are definitely some examples of where they have done traceability in smaller scale fisheries. And I think that's a great question, because then it gets right back to that initiate phase, right? Which is, what's your goal for doing it? What's the benefit to doing it? And then working from there to see what the barriers may be or why it may be beneficial.
Yeah, definitely. And scaling your goals and who you're talking to. I mean, certainly I personally have worked with traceability of even artisanal or recreational fisheries, very small. So there are ways to go about it, but you really need to be sensitive to who you're collecting data from, and hopefully have them help you design your traceability program so that they are motivated to use it, input data accurately, and yeah, it's helpful. We have some results. We're a little bit longer on the poll.
I'm waiting a little bit longer. We haven't gotten that many responses.
Okay.
Another question has come in the chat. How do responsible regions, fishery public endorsers, support traceability across ecosystems? How do you manage private seafood contributes supply chain using multiple protocols?
I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Sarah, do you?
I don't understand the second half, but I think I understand the first one, which is, if I'm understanding it correctly, about how responsible regions and fisheries can support cross ecosystem traceability. So that sort of, in my mind, is getting to sort of a scale question and also a collaboration question. So in terms of how we were thinking about collaboration, cooperation, when it comes to traceability programs with this work, we are very supportive and have seen really promising things in terms of governments having even intergovernmental agreements for managing fish stocks. And that certainly could apply to traceability. We would love for it to apply to social responsibility more often as well, because often, that's not something that's cooperatively approached. But yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of growth in terms of government to government cooperation, but also business to government cooperation, and more regional applications of traceability. In fact, SALT's had a lot of conversations over the last year thinking about regional approaches to implementing ACDT. And I think that's only going to grow. And certainly it's going to take a lot of different stakeholders to make that happen, from civil society groups through to managers and governments.
Great. And Scott, please do feel free to write us individually, and I will be happy to try and get a better answer for you as our time expires here. And Marta, thank you also for that comment. Certainly a group that we are concerned and mindful of, and so I'm happy to also talk with you a little bit more after this webinar about what approaches might be to address some of those social concerns you noted. Until then, I will just say thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today, your really thoughtful questions. It was excellent. We hope to hear from you more. Please email us at salt@fishwise.org, and we look forward to seeing you all really soon. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.